Buon pomeriggio.
Good afternoon. This is a meeting on the title of this year's edition of the meeting. Your name was born from what you gazed upon. This edition of the meeting has just started, but I believe that we are really going into the very core of what we would like to live and of what we would like everybody to perceive this week. First of all, I would like to welcome Guadalupe Arbona Abascal, who accepted this invitation of ours. She accepted to be with us on this very interesting session. I would like to introduce this session by saying that, like I said, this is the second day of this edition of the meeting, but it seems to me that a clear feature of this edition can already be recognized. At least this has already emerged from the initial sessions of the meeting and of the first days that we are living together, which is basically the emotional involvement when it comes to dialogue, when it comes to encounter, relations. In other words, we're all longing for that. So basically, this anguish, this heartbreaking pain, in order to reach the longing for the encounter and for the relation. The very same title of this year's edition of the meeting indicates the need for an encounter. Your name was born from what you gazed upon. This already clearly indicates an intense relationship, a relationship that is not simply that has to deal with gazing upon something and not simply looking at something. I mean, this indicates a relationship which is full of affection. Guadalupe will talk about dynamics and the importance of this gazing upon, of this gaze, and of what it generates. And I would like to underline that in this meeting, everything is under the auspices of relation. Everything basically points towards the other as an asset, as well as towards the enhancement and the promotion of what is different as the conditio sine qua non in order for us to proceed. So getting to know each other in spite of our diversities, feeling esteem for one another in spite of our diversities. And this applies to everything. Suffices to think about the interpersonal relations. Esteem and the recognition of the other person's diversity can change the relations. But we should also think about this of the same topic about politics. Much has been said about politics these days. This idea changes a lot our idea of politics. If the ideas of the other is not an origin of conflict, but rather as the starting point for the common solution of a problem, or also, for example, international issues, the coexistence of people with different beliefs and faiths, or the need for peace and well-being, or, for example, the respect for the earth where we live, or welcoming others, welcoming the other. How can all of these be dealt with and faced within a relationship and within an individualistic perspective? I believe that everything in the meeting is characterized by this. This is particularly striking for us because those who have already visited the areas of the meeting this year have already understood this. You can perceive anywhere the wealth and the kind of miracle of this kind of work done together. If you go and see the exhibitions, if you visit the various areas of this edition of the meeting, if you look at the way in which we organize our agenda and the same events, the same shows in the evenings, you will notice that beyond everything, there's not an agent with a relationship with an agent, but rather there is a relationship with people, with encounters. This is a real peculiarity of the meeting, of this year's edition of the meeting. So we invited Guadalupe, and this is what she asked us for. So I'm going to provide her with an answer. Guadalupe is a professor of Spanish literature at the Complutense University in Madrid. She's visiting professor at the Harvard University. She was visiting professor in Cambridge as well as in many other important universities. Her research focuses on the Spanish literature of the 20th and 21st century in relation with other literature. So in other words, in the comparison between languages. She works with the media, she received lots of grants, she's a member of lots of scientific committees, and she has experienced all of this not as a mere academic commitment, but also as a very important educational commitment, meaning that what she's dealing with, so the beauty of poetry, the beauty of literature, are the very same topics which she focuses on in her relation with her students. And I think this is the most beautiful thing that one can say, because when poetry is used to promote educational relation, that's the best important thing. So that's why we invited Guadalupe. We invited Guadalupe also because poetry has a lot to say about the topic of this year's edition. Gazing is not a mechanical act. Gazing means emotion. And emotion vis-a-vis the mystery is actually the very same foundation for poetry. So that is why we thought that someone who works with poetry and who makes poetry the most important tool of her relation with the youngest, who uses poetry as an element to make her life richer, could be a very good guest to invite us through for this year's edition of the meeting. So, Guadalupe Arbona Pascal, your name was born from what you gazed upon. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Emilia. I am the living symbol of the meeting, welcoming and hugging people. There are three feelings which are particularly important to me. First of all, I am really grateful for the invitation. At the same time, I have to say, I find myself in an awkward position. I've been participating in the meeting for a year, and I've always sat in the floor, or I have always participated looking for a screen to follow sessions. I will do what I was asked for. In other words, I will talk about beautiful stories that tell us a lot about our truest feelings. And then the third feeling is disappointment. I am disappointed because I do not speak your language so well. And I speak this kind of mixture between Italian and Spanish. But I hope that also this way, using the words of those who would come to Italy from Spain at the times of Cervantes, they always said, Italia mia ventura, Italy is my adventure. So thank you very much, and thank you to all of you who contribute to make my soul wider. So the verse in the title of the meeting is full of suggestions. And it provides us with lots of elements which can be of interest for all of us. I will first start with the two first terms of the title, the name and the birth, the concept of birth. We were all given a name when we were born. Newborn babies are given a name so that actually these babies become a person with their own name, and this name is unique, unrepeatable. And all parents, it is the parents who think of a name for their child. So we are called with our name, even if we do not know how to speak. And then they would tell us, Clara, Carmina, Fernando, they would call us by our name. And when we started toddling, they would call us Anna or Sergio or Javier or Cecilia, simply to warn us of a possible danger. And then when we grew up once more, we were waked up to go to school and start our day, and maybe telling us, Guadalupe, wake up, you have to go to school. So your name was born from what you gazed upon. Wojtyla makes reference to the Veronica, so the woman who would used a cloth to wipe away the face of Jesus. And that is why the expression that is referred to the Veronica induces us to think about this question. If our name was given to us already at birth, if this is an asset that is confirmed as soon as we grow up, then why should this be born from what we gazed upon and from what we, not simply from what we see, but rather from what we gaze upon? So in the Veronica, the name is generated not so much from the birth, but from an encounter. So probably another name is necessary, a name that indicates the need to be reborn and have a new name. We do not know how Veronica, what her name was. Probably the woman who would touch the mantle of Jesus had a name. She was the one who was really touched by the person she cared for, and who became the very same person with the person that she cared for. So Veronica, this is the way that Veronica was given her name. So her story was the story of a second birth. And the verse directly arrives at our times. I think that in no times exactly as in present times, people have felt the nostalgia for being born. Some literary works I will make reference to. These literary works talked about me, they talked about my human reference, and I'm going therefore to develop my contribution in 4 parts. And these 4 parts will be accompanied by the beautiful images of Guillermo Alfaro. So the first part, I am not yet born. As you can see from the picture, this is a silent world that is waiting for something. Today's men and women express their desire to be born with an internal cry. This is a longing, a desire that stems from the deepest part of their life. Sometimes this is expressed through nostalgia or through a feeling that goes deep in their heart. So something that they lost by leaving. In other cases, this can be shown as a desperate need, as a cry, as a painful cry. In both cases, this comes from a feeling of melancholy towards a world that, when it was discovered, was conceived as harmonic, as flawless, as a happy world. Pedro Almodovar, the director Pedro Almodovar, describes the nostalgia of his childhood in his latest film. The protagonist of Dolor y Gloria is a director. He's a burnout director. He feels depressed and empty after years of success. He's apathic. Nothing more interests him. He stops writing. He no longer directs film. He rejects invitations. So he lives in a constant state of insomnia. He finds life again only if he remembers his childhood. Only if he remembers the scenes when he was a child and he lived in a very poor country of the Spain of the 1950s. So at the time, he could still perceive the love by his mother. So the others and the memories of the childhood make him think about the joy, and this joy sadly got lost over time. So Dolor y Gloria is the narrative of how one can lose an asset. Is it possible to go back to childhood? In the Pedro Almodovar actually shows a desire which compares to ours. In other words, our desire to feel things exactly as if they've only recently been discovered. The need to feel that, for example, like when we were children, and we knew that we were children, and therefore we knew that our mother was their protector. The Spanish poet Federico Garcia Lorca wrote a letter when he was 22 to Regino Sainz de la Masa, a guitar player. And in this letter, he confesses a terrible thing. And he says that that's something that he can say only in secret. I discovered something terrible. Don't tell anyone. I haven't yet been born. I live as if I am borrowed. What I have inside is not mine. And we'll wait and see if I am actually born. So my soul has not opened at all. Sometimes I even feel that my heart is made of tin. So Lorca feels that he's alien to himself, and at the same time, however, he wishes to be born again. So the lack of this birth makes his heart, makes him perceive his heart as a metal heart and not as a heart made of flesh. And then he said, actually, my soul has not opened, but how can one open one's soul? Other acute personalities of our time also expressed the need to be born again. Albert Camus, one of the French writer who was one of the most committed artists of his time, also felt the same and wrote fantastic pages on his birth. He did that in the latest work where he was working on the first man. The manuscript was found in a notebook that the writer had with him when he was extracted from the car where he died after an accident. And 3 years before, he had been awarded with the Nobel Prize for Literature. It is surprising that after receiving such an important award, Camus wrote about his humble, discreet, and silent birth. Camus had been at the center of the European debate, had been considered by the French media. So this artist who had made his readers tremble with his history of the absurd. So the very same Camus imagines his own birth and comes back to kind of investigate on the meaning of a new beginning. And actually does so through an alter ego, Jacob Nai. So the opening chapter of Jacques Guarnieri talks about this chapter in Algiers. They two were traveling on a cart. The mother had a very nice face with wavy hair, brown eyes. And then with the evening, the woman was about to give birth to the child, to Jacques. And when looking at her newborn baby, the mother had a smile which had, in a way, kind of filled her fatigue. So in spite of the fatigue, in spite of the oddity of generating a child in a foreign country, so these bad elements were not capable of, in a way, eliminating this smile of a mother giving birth to a child. And this is how Camus basically recreates with his imagination his first cry, as soon as he saw the light of the world, and also the smile of his mother. Allow me now to briefly comment on this. When I wrote this novel, a conversation between Giovanni Tessori and Don Giussani came to my mind. The book that contains this conversation is entitled Il senso della nascita, the sense of birth, and actually testifies to the conversation that the two had in February 1980 on the topic of birth. I compared the dates, and I thought that probably Tessori would have liked to read the book by Camus. He couldn't make it because Tessori died in 1993, so 1 year before that the daughter of Camus had the book by her father be published after his death. So I would have really much liked to participate in a dialogue with these three personalities on the topic. So the conversation between the two Italians starts from the wish of Camus and of an entire generation of Europeans who suffer because of an absence. And Giussani discovered the depth of the cry. I think that, like Giussani said, that young people are characterized by this absence. The birth is not present. It is as if young people have not yet become aware of this being dependent, of the fact that they were really wanted. So the reply that we give to this identity between pain and hope depends on whether these people have already had this feeling of birth, of this feeling of the fact that they were really wanted. The supreme feeling is exactly this, that of being wanted by someone. So their reaction depends on whether this presumption has, in a way, manifested itself or not. The very same Tessori appears to answer to Camus, to a torn Camus. He actually feels this absence, which is not an absence, but rather melancholy, nostalgia, so terrible nostalgia. Then, as my second point, 24 voices with 24 hearts. This desire to be born again, like I said before, using Lorca's words, I have not yet been born, may hide the insecurity of the fact that we do not know who we are. So pain can become so insisting that desire multiplies and it becomes fragmented, so that one tries to be, for example, someone, even if you are many more personalities, like Pirandello said. So one stems from the perception of the birth as a gift to the search, which is a search that is led by the fact that we want to be as many people as possible. So once we lose sight of our first birth, we try and become many different people. We want to be, for example, a certain types of people in the morning, other people's in, for example, at night. So the very same Lorca said that he felt himself fragmented in many different eyes. So the eye of the past and that of the future change. So were there 1,000 Federico Garcia Lorcas who were basically lost, lying in the warehouse of the future? I contemplated many others. Federico Garcia Lorcas bent one over the others, waiting to be inflated with gas so that they could fly without any precise direction. So this perception of being disgregated into many other people can be found in the music that our young people listen to. So this basically this lost of the feeling of being birthed makes them feel fragmented. And this is basically sung by the switch 1424. Everything is broken in 24 paces. So one different thing for any moment of the leaving. So they see things separated, and then in the end everything that is lived, for example oceans or skies or places or failures or hearts, everything must be abandoned to be replaced by the following one, unless there's someone who kind of brings the pieces together back. So if we look at our young people, they even look outside the eye, so they perceive a generational mismatch, which is very common. Young people now look for the number of likes, they look for virtual realities. Any new like on Instagram is a surrogate to express a preference. So we want to feel loved. We want to have someone who tells us that they've seen us through a picture. So we are currently going through a period in which apparently algorithms can define who we are. Certain scientists are telling us that algorithms can define us better than what we do. There is a bestseller entitled Homo Deus, and in this bestseller, Harari wonders what is the I? And then he concludes that the calculation of the algorithm basically makes it possible to get to know a person much better than the partner knows, and better by the person himself or herself. So Harari talks about a data-centric culture. So based on this statement, one might think that the mystery of the eye, so this vibration that that accompanies us from the very moment when we wake up until we go to bed, might be entirely solved. So the calculation of our likes, or the collection of our purchases on Amazon, of our searches on Google, or the analysis of the pictures that we load on Instagram, or the number of tweets that we follow, all of this is enough material to define who we are. So can this be an answer to the topic of the meeting? Your name was born from what you gazed upon. So the data we live in the web, is this data enough to tell us who we are? So our search for identity takes place through pixels, and that's the interesting, thrilling thing of the time. In other words, nobody can now take for granted who we are, who you are. So we are involved in a constant search of the many possibilities. But then can we hope for a pixel, for a color point which is shiny and brilliant? Can this single pixel help us come back to our origin? So what pixels does reality have? The hypothesis of modernity actually proposed an internal reflection to solve the issue of identity. One of the consequences of today's failure is that one prefers the net to be preferred. The more you feel that you are unique, the more I understand that I cannot solve this need. In other words, to a certain extent, the evolution of postmodernity, so from the analysis to the search for an external measurement, brings about a very interesting change. It highlights some kind of, in other words, we want to be preferred and followed. We need someone to tell us. And then we should see if in reality, carefully looked for, if in this reality you can find something that is worth looking for. So Luigi Giussani's offered a nice proposal in the 10th chapter of Il lavoro religioso. il senso religioso, sorry, because that is fundamental to understand who I am. And this started from one of the examples that Giussani proposed. In other words, that of imagining us at the moment of our birth, when we open our eyes and we see things for the first time. But this is done at our current age. This might sound a little bit awkward. This is exactly how I considered it when I first saw it. This seemed to me as almost ridiculous. But at the same time, I also started grasping the possibility of something different. I could recognize the very good example, and this example would not leave me indifferent. So there is a sense of rebellion towards the idea that there was something that pre-existed me. I kind of rejected the moment in which the I and reality would find themselves. So for Giussani, the order of discoveries is fundamental. And that is why he insisted so many times on this topic in the chapter. Many of you know the book, but I would like to insist on this once again. Like I said, Giussani invites us to imagine a new birth. If we opened our eyes for the first time with the conscience we have now, what elements would be more important? Probably things. This is, he would say. So the astonishment of a presence. In other words, to discover the true I. So that set of needs and certainties that we are, the things for which we work and move, it is necessary to live the reality intensively. So when reading this chapter, I often wondered why he would say this, because actually whenever I wake up in the morning, first thing I do is basically is to think about myself and the things I have to do. And Giussani instead said that things come first. So I basically thought, okay, the reality is here. So things are a very wonderful scenario, I would say to myself. But actually, we should start from the definition of the I to then see how things are. As a modern woman, I would rebel against this order. And at the same time, I was also kind of enslaved to my own thoughts. So also my self would drown on this. And I could not get free from that example that would always come out. So I started realizing the many occasions in which what I had ahead of me would tell much more of me than any other thought. So I started looking at the things that could really fascinate me, the things that would attract me and touch me. And so I started saying that my order was more thought than real. I started appreciating the things that could help me dissipate my confusion or would make me understand and discover something new of myself. So I would have to put the assumption by Don Giussani to the test. I realized that Don Giussani's thought is such important top-level anthropological turning point that it deserves high consideration. Don Giussani proposed this work to then come that factor that really reveals the unity between the pixels. In other words, a presence that makes things true, alive, and attractive. This is something that makes it possible for the self to know itself during an encounter without decomposing the pixels or self-analysis. The first discovery was that I myself was a gift. Let me give you two examples out of the many examples I collected over the years that clearly show how this anthropological turning point that Giussani proposed actually works. So in other words, how, when you start from a factor, actually the I emerges. The first one refers to a university student in Madrid. His life is basically characterized and touched by the meeting with the professor. So the student says, you woke the mankind up that was sleeping in myself as a person. So it was not easy to come out of what he was coming from, because his story was that of an unhappy child that never felt himself loved, and because of this he started to write his own story. So the child refers to himself, and he had experienced fear very much. Unfortunately, thanks to due to the fact that his father, a military officer, nostalgic of dictatorship, would beat him. So the young child therefore went into drugs and alcohol. So I would cry every night, and this cries well expressed a million of different feelings that he could not tell anyone because he would not trust anyone. And it was then that actually I understood that praying was a real need and not a ritual. So he then described his enrolling at university, arriving at university. He was at university without really feeling that he wanted to be there, with his heart full of fear and the inertia that he would have in facing things. So that was a period of ups and downs, and I really started thinking about suicide. So it's a very bad feeling to see the train coming every morning and have the certainty, feel the certainty that nobody would have cared if I had killed myself. So the student describes the meeting with the professor as a second birth. In other words, as himself entering a place where you find someone who's waiting for you. So your office was the only place in which I really felt myself as completely involved. For the first time, I felt myself as being part of something in which there was someone who was waiting for me and would count on me. And in his letter to the professor, he says, I've been existing for 24 years, but I've lived only for 4. I was born because his teacher would actually had previously welcomed the letter of a body who was crying for help. The professor had actually answered that letter. So even if he was not generated by her, still I would call you mother. And the second example is contained in a poem by Pedro Salinas. So the poet talks about his love experience. So the meeting, the encounter with his lover is a real event. This is a presence that the poet chose. And thanks to this choice, he was capable of coming out of the void. So when the lover chose him, actually, he himself managed to choose himself. So that moment is well exemplified in the moment because it basically marks a moment before and a moment after. So this happens, this was true, this is true, it was on a given day, in a given moment that marks the time. But the time comes when the poet fears, is afraid of the fact that something so beautiful might get lost. So I am hugged to you without asking for anything, because I fear that this is not true. So these last verses induce us to a further reflection. If you fear for the authenticity of the love match, if one has doubts over its continuity, how can one discover long-lasting love? How can one find its truth? So what is the reality that we should count on? that could in a way resist disenchantment or delusions or the passing of time. So the student would understand this and he would conclude his letters with the wish of finding answers. So Salinas, on his part, felt the distance between him and his beloved one, and he wondered whether another light was to be seen in the world. Is there anything that we can find and that does not get lost, but which actually makes me be born again every day? So fourth point, the name. A voice on the earth, a writing in heaven. So let's have a look at history to try and find this pixel. In history, there is a man who walked on this land and told his friends, be happy, be content because your names are written in heaven. He said this on earth and pronounced the name of each and any of his friends at the same time. And by doing so, he would basically announce presence in heaven. This sentence is much more important of the when and where it was uttered. So can the fact that our names are written in heaven, can this fact be meaningful? I personally actually felt as living on the earth. But let's go back to Jesus. He promised that simply because he had pronounced the name of some men and women while he was walking in Palestine, and the intensity with which he did that was commented by Julian Caron. So Jesus pronounced their name, Maria, Zaccheo, Matteo, Matthew. They said, woman, you should not cry. So what communication should... so the presence and the focus on the self was so strong in them. They could no longer look at themselves and at reality. They could do so only through that light, through that voice, through the intensity with which their name was pronounced. This means that he called them on the earth to, in a way, start a relationship of esteem. So a radical story that was so important that this could be brought to heaven. So let's focus on how this way of calling people by name would mean. What basically did, what was the characteristic of that way of calling people that could help them, that could help the traits of their name to be pronounced? Zaccheo is an example of this. This is shown in Luke's Gospel. And Luke's basically said, using Jesus' sentence, your names are written in heaven. And that is how he knew that his name was among them, because his name was heard on was pronounced by God. So Zaccheo was a tax collector. So for them it was important. For people like him, was very easy to get money from taxes. He would live in Jericho, a small town almost in the middle of the desert near Jerusalem, surrounded by the most ancient walls that one can know. A town full of, for example, fig trees or palm trees. Zaccheo was not very much liked. He would live in a house that was much nicer by the house of his neighbors. The foundations of his house were in stone and was embellished by Roman capitals. Nobody wanted to be with him. The rabbis in the synagogue would refer to him when they would accuse tax collectors. And they would actually tell everybody to avoid tax collectors. Those who would go around with people like him would be negative people. So women who are always braver would avoid Zaccheo. The eldest women would curse him when they saw him passing by. The married women would look at him with anger because they knew that half of the salary of their men, of their husbands, was taken away in taxes. Not even young children could stand him because they would send stones and pebbles at him to injure him. So that is why it was strange that Zacchaeus went out of his house. It was strange that he would get out of his house that day. But he was actually annoyed in being alone with slaves. It was, of course, necessary to have the right precautions. He would always have his face covered in order to avoid the glimpses of the others. He would sit in the darkest part of the synagogue, maybe hidden behind the columns. And evening before, he had heard that Jesus would have been in town that day. So a man who would do wonders. This man would come from Jerusalem, and he was preceded by his fame. So Zacchaeus didn't sleep at night because the earnings of that day could not distract him. He had everything and had nothing. He felt himself void. And then the day after he made a decision, he would go to the square to see Jesus. Everybody's attention would have been devoted, would have been paid to Jesus, and Zacchaeus would not have been seen. So he wore a cloth that was even poorer than the other ones in order not to be recognized. He covered part of his face and the head, and then when he went out of his house, he realized of the many people around. He followed the crowd. He started listening. He asked for information from children, trying to cover his face so that young children could not recognize him. And children told him that the rabbi would have basically crossed the square. So he reached the square. He could not see anything, so he smiled when looking at the children who would play in the square of the sycamore by throwing at each other the fruits of the sycamore. And so he decided that he would go up a sycamore to see better because he was not tall and could not see. He felt very curious. In recent times, he didn't feel safe. He had the fence of his garden made higher in order for everybody not to see it. So he would fear everybody, women and children and the priests. He would talk only to those who would praise him because they feared his power. So he was amazed of himself because he didn't know what to do.
While he was waiting for a stranger to come round, somebody who had nothing to do with him, he felt so bad. Well, maybe he thought, I can look for confusion in order to forget my boredom. I'm tired of being always enclosed. And then he said, always to himself, oh, there is no other solution. I have to become richer and richer, and I have to remain enclosed and still lead a secluded life. And then a group of children just started following him, and the rabbi was far away, was not that far, just a few meters, but Zacchaeus could not see him in the face because there was a strong gaze around all the people in the surroundings. But then the Nazarene was gazing, and Zacchaeus was jealous of a little girl that was gazed by the Nazarene, and the Nazarene was gazing upon the little girl as if she was the only one. So it was considered as a master, and certainly his gaze was different. He kept on coming over, and it was going towards the sycamore tree trunk. And Zacchaeus just went up and up, climbed up, and the frayed branches started bending. He wanted to see his face, but he couldn't from top. At one point, he saw that he was looking up towards the branch where he was, and he thought, oh, how weird. Well, I always try, he just noticed that. He always tried to avoid gazes of people. Well, there's so much to look at all around, and why is he watching exactly here in this direction? Was he watching the tree, the sycamore tree? So looking up was the strangest and most weird act to do, and this is exactly what the Nazarene was doing. And Zacchaeus just realized that the Nazarene was looking at him, was gazing upon him, and the Nazarene told him, Zacchaeus, please come down immediately, because today I have to come round to your place, to your house. So we may imagine what was going through the head of that man. Zacchaeus, Zacchaeus, yeah. Zacchaeus was his name, and that man was pronouncing his name in a way that was absolutely unique. Nobody had ever pronounced his name like that, not even when he was so young, a little boy, even though that voice pitch reminded him of his mother and of his brothers and siblings when they were playing in the main square or somewhere else, and also that and his father that used to call them in the evening, and also that sweet girl that had talked to him with tenderness and that he had dreamed about for so many days. And that gaze, well, that voice seemed to express so much, as if he knew about his pain, and as if he could somehow embrace his lack of sleep and his lack of satisfaction. But how could he know his name? Maybe the people from the temple sent him. Well, maybe he was about to tell him off, but he thought it's impossible. His voice was joyful, was not rigorous or angry. It was full of sympathy and affection, and his heart just jumped and sort of missed a beat. I mean, what was happening? It was sort of filling his heart full of music any time that man was pronouncing his name, as if the walls all surround his house and all around his heart were just stumbling down, and time seemed to be frozen. It was not afraid any longer. So anxiety had disappeared and vanished, and now it couldn't care less about protecting his rich his rich goods, his property. I mean, it was not obsessed anymore by people stealing his things. Now only that instant in time was existing. The past and the future that usually tormented him had disappeared and vanished. But that man had become everything, the horizon of everything. Zacchaeus felt really gazed upon, and he wanted to look better and identify the traits of his face, see the color of his eyes. If he could maybe smell his sort of smell, well, he would have known more. And then he watched, he gazed, and he saw, and that, moreover, even more so, that master, that man wanted to visit his house, not the disciple's house or anybody else, but him who was secluded by society, a stranger, somebody who felt like a stranger in his own city, and just a tax collector. And so then Zacchaeus came down from the tree very rapidly, and he even unveiled accidentally his face. He came down the tree very quickly and ran home to be ready to welcome him. And he felt a very strange, unusual energy. He wanted to see him from a close, and he somehow rediscovered his senses, and the colors of things were much, much brighter. Everything was different. Zacchaeus was getting born again. It was different, and even moved differently. He started sort of walking, standing up very smoothly. He did not hide any longer. He was even smiling. What has changed? Everything and nothing. He was bringing something inside him. He was walking like holding with him a treasure, and he was somehow holding with him the face and the heart of that gaze. And so Luke tells how Zacchaeus had a second birth, a rebirth. That hint of curiosity led him towards what he was hoping for, being gazed upon by somebody who could give him back all the rest. Inside the close space of his life, the perspective of destiny had just landed unexpectedly. And so let's draw our conclusion. I invite you to use your imagination once again. What would happen if those were the interlocutors with whom I would have talked this afternoon here today with you and with Emilia? What if they were the interlocutors of our questions, of our deepest wishes? Imagine a dialogue that generates suddenly the things that we want the most, the things that we need, the things that somehow unconsciously hold inside us. So, what if friendship were to become all of a sudden more intense, and so warmed up by the sort of the trust and the confidence, heart open up? It's not harder to imagine. Why? Because they are like us. Federico Garcia Lorca, Albert Camus, Salinas, the musicians of Switchfoot and Almodovar are like us, exactly us. They are like our colleagues, our neighbors, our parents, our children. Imagine that here and now Federico Garcia Lorca could be with us, whispering into our ears that is not born yet. Dear Federica, you can leave behind fear and solitude. You can have a rebirth. Look at Zacchaeus and imagine and think about Camus just wiping and crying because he's an orphan. Albert, I can understand your tears, and because we are all children, we are all sons and daughters. And if I were to talk to Almodovar, I would tell him, oh yes, Pedro, it's true. Even if you are 54, you can still live like a child. It is possible to depend on the tenderness and of the joy of the present. So let's try to go back to the intensity of the love of Selena's. Imagine him while he talks about the beauty of her beloved one, and at the end, with a hint of nostalgia, he tells us he wants more. It's true, Pedro. Love just unveils a sort of insatiable desire of what is limitless, of infinite. And there is a beauty that tells us about that. And if the Switchfoot Band were here to sing about the fragments that young people love so much, and if anybody would say, hey, come on, guys, well, there is somebody making up the pieces again, and it happened to me, so it's hard, but it's possible. So these are very audacious answers, but I'm here to tell you frankly that I'm not here to teach you anything, but I really try to let experiences just be generated in me and generate inside myself a presence that makes me like a daughter.
È bello.
It's beautiful to see how sometimes questions leave room for emotions. And while you were talking, so many questions just raised inside me and were raised inside me. But it's nice sometimes to let emotion and feelings just take over the silence, because I think we all need that. There is a way to be touched and to be moved that somehow triggers things. And a moved and touched heart is a moving heart. And if it is true that so many times a word that we hear immediately generates questions, a desire to get to know more, sometimes just a sort of poetic suggestion just creates an immediate emotional reaction that let us feel grateful and move us so deeply and intensely. And it is exactly what I experienced here today. So that's why I do not want to ask you anything. Because while you were talking and delivering your speech, I was trying to think about our youth, so the young people you care for so much, I care for so much. These young people are so needy, and I think that today the most important need is to let ourselves be moved and to feel moved. And here today we experienced the strength and the force of poetry. We had this proof here today, and this is the real sort of uniqueness of poetry. The way you structured your speech here today let us fully understand how desperately we need poetry and being moved. So many have been brought up through poetry and music, and that happened not by accident. So thank you very much. We feel very grateful to you for this deep experience. And here at the meeting as well, we always try to go back to this kind of language and to share them and offer them not like a sort of additional thing, not as something that is less important or less noble with respect to other kinds of debates and other topics. There's a lot going on at the meeting. There are plenty of exhibitions, of shows, but this is the beauty of our event. For instance, exhibitions can be enjoyed for free. Well, this is not always the case. There are beautiful exhibitions, including art exhibitions, with important works, and you can enjoy them and visit them for free because we strongly believe that beauty is so important, so valuable. So, my final words are the following. Well, all that is possible as a result of 40 years of work altogether. And in order to be able to keep working like that altogether with the same level of freedom, well, we kindly ask you to donate according to your preferred mode. So we kindly ask you to donate so that the meeting can keep going on. And donations are very important for the further existence of the meeting, and they're also a deed of responsibility. So there are special areas with a red heart and with invitation to donate where you can donate. But please just donate where our voluntary workers with a specific please donate sort of signs are just positioned. Thank you very much, and I wish you a good afternoon. Thank you very much.